Bom dia, vou só dizer umas palavras em português e depois passarei para inglês. Gostaria só de dar as boas-vindas a todos os participantes de língua portuguesa nas suas múltiplas variedades e dizer que é com imenso prazer que vejo esta assistência e que espero que seja... que tenham 2 dias propícios de discussão e de debate em torno deste seminário. Vou pedir desculpa, bem sei que há aqui pessoas, muitas de língua portuguesa, mas vou passar para o inglês porque me parece que é talvez a língua comum a mais pessoas que aqui estão. So, I will speak in English. I know there is a lot of language people from different countries, but I think the English is perhaps the most common language between all the speakers and the chairs and even the assistants. So I will try to make and to say some words in English. And I would like to begin to welcome all the speakers, of course, chairs and assistants to this seminar. It's my great pleasure to welcome you in this meeting about social contract organized by me, but namely by Rogerio Tostes, who was in fact the soul and the body responsible for this organization. And it's him that is in fact the main chair of this seminar. In my name and in name of CDEUS, the Research Center, I would like to stress his commitment, the commitment of Rogerio, and his dedication to the organization of this seminar. One word also for all the team that was behind this organization, namely Mariana Soler, as you can see there, Francisco Brito, and also Ivo Santos. But in fact, this seminar was only possible thanks to the interest and availability shown by all the speakers invited. To them, my gratitude. The seminar was thought and built as an online because, of course, there's some troubles with some.
Yeah, let me try to, okay.
This seminar was built like an online event because, of course, I am in Portugal, Rogerio is in Brazil. However, I would like to think that in the near future, we could speak about the opportunity to make a live seminar, perhaps taking place here in Évora, a very, not a very small city, but a very nice city. And so we can think in the future to make something more agreeable to all of us. When some months ago, Rogerio speak about about his interest in organizing this seminar, following some long online discussions about different projects and about different applications that we have made to different institutions. And of course, after many big discussions, always online, of course, it seems to me immediately that it was a very good idea, particularly because it was in line with some subjects and discussions that we have had, namely in the field, if we can say like that, of political history. But also because for CDEUS, the subject was a crucial one. The scientific project of CDEUS is focused in the South and in societal changes of these societies in a broader way. In this framework, the social and political issues are particularly important, and as an interdisciplinary research center that we cross knowledge and, of course, contributions from different scientific fields in a long chronology. Additionally, discussing about political contract and the boundaries of the political contract, having as counterpart concepts as resistance and rupture, is today a subject of extreme importance and, above all, very changeable for each one of us. In a time where the limits of the state and the action of the state, and above all, when the institutional building defined in the second part of the 20th century is, we can say, in a certain way, put in question in many and different ways, we, the historians of the Middle Ages or of the early modern times, and we can discuss one day about that also, or even of modern period, are increasingly pressured not to look the roots of a process. This would be, in fact, a very teleological approach, but for the understanding of the political process and of the political and social behaviors in past times. Without forgetting, of course, the importance of the representations and, of course, of the medievalism in nowadays in the construction of contemporary discourses and practice of legitimacy. So in the next 2 days, we will hear about social contract, about the right to resist, and about rupture in different chronologies and in different spaces. The speakers will lead us not only to medieval Europe, but also to Africa, Asia, and America, territories linked by the marks of the European expansion and by the legitimacy problems caused by native resistance. I have no doubt that all of us will learn a lot in the next 2 days. Once more, I thank you very much, and I wish you all a very pleasant and interesting seminar. Rogerio?
Thank you, Professor Hermínia. Thank you very much. First of all, good morning to all colleagues who are present here today. First, I address a warm greeting to those present at this moment, despite all the different latitudes that do not always make it easy to follow an online event like this from such distant time zones. This is one of the prices, I think, we pay for the comforts of globalization, particularly this new globalization imposed on scientific meetings created recently with the pandemic scenario. Sensitive to these new conditions on the intellectual debate, we will celebrate the historical experiences of political debate in these 2 days of the online seminar. This first edition, which I hope will be followed by other new editions, we talk about dissent, rupture, and resistance. But this is not just any kind of resistance manifested by the sign of chaos or the rebellious uprising against all forms, political and legal. It is a form of resistance that calls for a return to the disturbed stabilities, to a supreme order of things that is supported by natural law. On the other hand, not every form of resistance will certainly be a mere gesture of rebellion or revolution. Before the break, with an established order of things was declared, the history of forms of resistance shows opposing the injustice of tyrannical power. The prince or the state that acts tyrannically is that anomalous symptom that must be expunged. The proposed rupture is not so against the order of authority, but against the deviation of its just means. Then, the jus resistendi is always manifested against the breach of the constitutional pact, read in view of an valletary social contract, if you so wish to say, between governors and governed subjects, at the time when the community assumes the conscience of its freedom and it requires, in different ways, the full capacity for popular representation. The passage from the Middle Ages to the first moments of modernity is filled with these examples of episodic claim, which sought to recover the lost order before revolutionizing the way established by moral institutions, by good and old customs, by the nature that links and disconnects the links between the individuals. All of this was in the end sanctioned by the divine mandate itself. The simple recognition of how the instance of power were to prevail allowed the deviations and abuses against him, the power itself, to be collectively claimed. In this way, the people of Florence, to give one of the classical examples, this is the way that these people behaved in the late 20th century, inspiring the no less controversial wording of the Ordinamento di Giustizia. Consequently, those people who ordinarily did not intend to occupy power or assume the office of governing could be supported by the extreme need and the extrema necessitatis, idea is there already, to restore the disturbed order, to rebel against the usurper who had unlawfully contaminated the burden of civil power. This created a false order that served to maintain the tyrant's power, who by far was called a quasi-devil by several preachers in the 14th century. The recognition of this state of affairs inspired jurists and theologians to elaborate their doctrines on the same subject. This effort was to deepen the terms of the constitutional pact, delimited the necessary bounds of power and clarify its ends, and prevent any usurpation from being transformed into a just claim to the instituted order. Hence, we read a series of careful elaborations that try to discern the lawfulness of resistance from the mere act of treason. There is a great deal of this material, in particular from the 14th century, especially made by legists like Cinus, Bartolus, Baldus, who expanded the exegesis of the subject, giving the rich and conflicting reality of Italian cities. It is clear that the theoretical construction of a public order was woven into the ambiguity of political concepts that could serve both to guarantee freedom and to its critical suppression. This fascinating ambiguity is expanded on the chronological framework that runs throughout the Reformation and the debates about freedom with La Serenissima University of Salamanca. In this way, the problem of freedom and obedience to the sovereign power had been placed between extreme worlds. All of this must be profoundly reproposed in the light of these circumstances that are pregnant with new worldviews, new ideas of freedom. But despite the fact that this ambiguity of the resistance rebellion problem has persisted in this first modernity, that is, as an undeniable practice in the historical modus of a political association, there is something of medieval constitutionalism, if you can say so, that is discharged with the emergence of the liberal paradigm applied to political philosophy and then to positive law. When inventing the state, the ancient ties with the jus naturalism were seriously denied, Jews denying any claim to historical precedents in guaranteeing constitutional order. So Kant will say, so will Kelsen end. In Hans Kelsen's, the famous German jurist, in Kelsen's words, the advent of the state or the rule of law is a feat of its own normative order. No matter how many centuries a people or territory has existed, the only link that keeps the state order in place and the juridical validity is resulting from its legal institution. Any other evidence to show this link necessarily fails, is his words, as a matter of evidence. The fact that the individual belongs to the state, still according to Kelsen, is not a psychological issue, but only a juridical one. The history per se is denied as legal substract for this new constitutional model. This mere assumption ends up banning the right to resistance as an episode overcome by historical states or less evolved societies. In conclusion, the members of contemporary society have nothing to resist because the rational order is as complete as it is. Without going into the juice philosophical questions of that problem, the Kelsenian conviction falsifies the medieval roots of constitutional contractualism. The urgent need to resist abusive power, which often intends to speak in the name of the states, is not buried. Without pretending to attribute our disturbance of the present to the problems of history, let us try to rescue these reflections in the light of mixed government historical frames and within types of society that constituted their models of sovereignty interlaced by the jus communi, when a titanic rule of law still doesn't exist. To think about the history of the right to resistance is to evoke all of this because it's there that normality of things is suspended. It is where it forces itself to rethink the base of an already shaking political order. In essence, the concept of resistance is made by a duality that contains both the longue durée of its legal significance and also its philosophical value, based on jus naturalis that authorizes the individual to rise against the abusive measures of a ruler. These two semantic references are in the precise domain of history, not only political history, that or philosophical thought, not that of legal history, but in the domain where the narrative of the event proves its different nuances of human experience. Here I end my first words, welcoming everybody, and I greet our distinguished guests who will dedicate themselves over these 2-day seminars to different aspects on a subject as wild and diffuse as the jus resistendi. I'd like to thank all the speakers for the priceless generosity in having accepted this invitation. And there's no doubt that your joint presence made this modest project much more important than we had hoped for from the beginning. I also have to thank you, some other colleagues who were unable to integrate these sessions, but have expressed their enthusiastic support for the project, such as Professor Antonio Furiot, Yael Remes, and Vicente Chalet. I also thank the initial acceptance of Professors Justine Baker and Fabrizio Titoni, even they could not be with us here today. And of course, as for the idea itself of dedicating new spaces for debate to the subject of jus resistendi, I would particularly like to thank you, Professor Diego Quaglioni, for his personal encouragement and immediate support. And also my warmest thanks to Professor Hermínia Vilar, who so promptly welcomed the initiative that we together promote to have this seminar. Wow. And now I'd like, indeed, of course, we start with the opening lecture to begin by Professor Diego Quaglioni. It's almost unnecessary to give a thorough introduction to his career when his works on political theory and Bertolini interpretations are a mandatory reference to anyone initiated on the subject. In addition to a large number of specialized publications on political legal thought covering the 13th to the 16th centuries, it's necessary at least to recall the careful critical editions he made of Bartolo's political treatise, and more recently, Dante's Alighieri de Monarchia. And if I am allowed to add like a personal reflection, one of the several merits of Professor Quaglioni in his long scientific career is to rehabilitate the forgotten common ground of the history of law with political theory, proving the relevance of these domains as an undeniable interconnection of the intellectual work of medieval thought. Wow. Professor Quaglioni is cattedratico professor of history of law at Università degli Studi di Trento, where he also leads the line of history of law studies at the Doctoral School of Scienze Giuridiche Europee Comparati. And without further ado, I give the floor to Professor Diego Quaglioni, who will now present to us his lecture entitled The Origins of the Early Modern Contractualism, the Law Digna Vox and its Interpreters. Professor Quaglioni, please.
Thank you, Rogerio. Thank you for this kind introduction. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and especially I would like to thank you, Rogerio, because I discussed with you the setting of this introductory lecture. We agreed that it would be useful to deliver it in English, and we agreed that it would be useful to summarize some general notes on a source of fundamental importance for our subject. Although it is well known, even in recent historical literature. Therefore, the purpose of this presentation is very limited. So in his seminal book, The Prince and the Law, 1200-1600, Sovereignty and Rights in the Western Legal Tradition, 1993, my friend Ken Pennington has written that only by looking back at the development of juridical political thought, we can assess whether continuity or discontinuity reigned between the 13th and 16th centuries, or whether the principles of medieval constitutionalism had some relationship with their modern correspondents. Simple answers cannot describe the complex evolution of Western theories of sovereignty, Ken Pennington said. Underline the deep rootedness of modern legal political thought in the tradition of jus commune, to the point of affirming that we may, with some satisfaction, reflect that when we return to a conception of sovereignty that recognizes norms outside the state's positive law, we shall be returning to a system of thought that has deep roots in Western law. The long medieval and early modern debate concerning the law digna vox belongs to that system of thought. The law digna vox, as we can read it in Justinian's Code 1:14:4, is a constitution of the Emperor Valentinian III, as everyone knows, dated in Ravenna to June 11, 429 AD. It is an edict whose content must be read together with that of the law Praedia Domus Nostre, Justinian's Code 1171:5, which was dismembered by the Justinian compilers to be placed as an expression of the fundamental principle under the title 14, De Legibus et Constitutionibus Principum, of book 1 of the first book of Justinian's Code. The very short text of the law is the following. Maybe I can share my screen with you. Oh, I don't know if it's clear. I provided a very short handout in order to facilitate the reading of the latent text. Digna vox maiestate regnantis, legibus alligatum se principem profiteri, it's number one. Adeo de autoritate iuris nostra pendet autoritas, et revera maius imperio est submittere legibus. Et oraculo presentis edicti, quod nobis dicere non patimus indicamus. That's a famous text of the Digna vox. It is, says the emperor, a declaration worthy of the ruler's majesty that the emperor confesses himself bound to the laws. We are, in fact, all the more authoritative the more the law is. And in truth, submitting the empire to the laws is proof of a greater power. And with the oracle of this edict, we will indicate that what we do not tolerate is lawful for us. The pronunciation is solemn, expressed as usual in a grave and redundant style. We want to deny that the emperor is allowed to grant privileges to individuals and thus violate the rules imposed by law. Therefore, when he produces edicts, leges edictales, general pragmatics, the emperor is a legislator. He can modify and repeal existing laws. However, when the legal norm has been created, not even the prince is allowed to violate it in order to privilege an individual position to the detriment of others. However, it would be wrong to forget that the law Digna vox has a very unique place in the history of legal and political thought, due to its importance in the longue durée of the medieval and the modern interpretation of Justinian's code as the maximum expression of a so-called legalitarian conception of maiestas, of sovereignty, legibus alligata, in direct opposition to the principle expressed in the well-known fragment by Ulpian in Digest 1331, where conversely the absolute character of the prince's power, his solutio legibus, is proclaimed. What weight such exegetical tradition has had up to the earliest emergence of the constitutional phenomenon in the Western legal tradition can be clearly seen from a famous text of the end of the 16th century, which is a true manifesto of anti-absolutist doctrines at the beginning of modern European public law. I obviously refer to the Vindice contra tyrannos, published in Latin in 1579 under the pseudonym of Stephanus Iunus Brutus, and immediately translated into French with the title de la puissance légitime du prince sur le peuple et du peuple sur les princes. The Vindice contra tyrannos have an exemplary beginning. The text opens by citing the whole text of the law Digna vox, the entire text of the law Digna vox. So recalling in an explicitly anti-absolutist key the normative and doctrinal tradition of the Ius Commune, with the solemn proclamation of the need for maiestas, for sovereignty, to be limited and subject to law and to laws. Here at number 2, you can You can see the text of the very beginning of the Vindice contra Tyrannos. Just a moment, please. Okay, here you can see the frontispiece of the French edition of 1581, and the very beginning. Les empereurs Théodose et Valentinian, Avolusian, grand prévôt de l'Empire, c'est une chose bien séante à la majesté d'un qui domine sur les autres de déclarer qu'il est prince lié aux lois. Aussi, notre puissance dépend de l'autorité du droit. Et à la vérité, c'est une chose plus excellente que la dignité de l'Empire même d'assujettir les principautés aux lois. Savoir faisons à tous par la déclaration de notre édicte, c'est là que nous ne voulons souffrir, nous être loisibles, donner à Ravenne l'11e jour de juin sur les consulats de Degli, etc., etc. Consequently, the treatise was divided into 4 main issues. These issues. 1, whether the subjects are to obey the prince when he commands something against the law of God. 2, whether it is lawful to resist the prince who wants to violate the law of God, and to whom it is lawful, in what way, and to what extent. 3, whether it is lawful to resist the prince who oppresses or ruins the public welfare, and to whom, how, and up to that point this is permitted. And finally, 4, whether neighboring princes can or must lend help to the subjects of other princes who are afflicted by religious persecution or oppressed by manifest tyranny. So the crisis of the religious wars saw the appearance of other works such as the Franco-Gallia by François Hotman, 1573, the Droit de Magistrat by Théodore de Bèze, 1574, the 6 Livres de la République by Jean Baudin, 1576, and of Innocent Gentillet, anonymously published again in 1576, Discours contre Nicolas Machiavel Florentin. All these works, although different in their intentions, posed the question of the nature of power, and even more, that of its restraints, that is, of its constitutional limits. So the law Digna Vox stands at the origin of any discussion concerning the limitation of power as a form of a shared and twofold sovereignty. Without it, and without the exegetical tradition developed from it, nothing, I think, can be understood of the medieval legal and political experience, whose first and foremost feature resides in selecting the conformity to the principle of equity as a fundamental criterion for justification and limitation of power. Outside this paradigm, it is difficult to understand how, in the corpus of Justinian Roman law, and therefore in the conceptual system that derives from it, principles of an absolutistic character, princeps legibus solutus est, and principles of a so-called legalistic character live together side by side, so to speak. The law Digna Vox argues precisely that it is worthy of the prince to want to consider himself subject to the laws, since his authority depends on the authority of the law, and submitting power to the laws means increasing and not decreasing sovereignty. Maius imperio est submittere legibus principatum. The system of limitations of power, therefore, resides in the will of power to conform to the law, in a sort of general and preventive self-limitation, proclaiming what power does not consider lawful in itself, quod nobis licere non patimur. The difficulty of reconciling principles so distant from each other as to appear in open conflict had already appeared to the medieval interpreters of the law Digna Vox. We have a demonstration of this, first of all, in Accorsius' Magna Glossa, which in the mid-13th century summarizes several decades of doctrinal discussions on the law Digna Vox. Accorsius, the Lusator, written in the middle of the 13th century, while declaring that submission to the laws had to be interpreted as voluntary. He says, digna est si dicat se velle. It's a worthy claim. He, the emperor, says that it's what he wants, had however shown an evident embarrassment concerning a proposition that appeared quite false. Just a moment. I'm sorry. I'm asking if you are able to look at the gloss on your screen. I hope. Yes? No? Can you see nothing? Can you see nothing?
No, Professor, but
okay.
Now, yeah.
Now, okay. Here is the text of the law Digna Vox, and here is the Accorsius gloss, his apparatus, where you can maybe you can see something of his interpretation of the law. So he says that someone thinks that the law permits the emperor to lie, but he disagrees, and he also says that maybe the law has to be interpreted as it said that his statement is due to reasons of convenience, of convenience, because the emperor derives from fortune. So this contradiction between sources of opposing content was resolved by the generation of the commentators. Cino da Pistoia, the great poet jurist, who was Dante's best friend, at the beginning of the 14th century, distanced himself from the gloss, denying its interpretation and supporting the concept of the prince's submission to the law, de honestate, because honor is nothing but a sacred bond of law, a sacrament of power. And Cino says, I translate from his Latin into English. Cino says that it is true that the emperor is not bound by the laws, for laws originate from him and authority depends on them, so that consequently they cannot bind him, although he cannot violate them. Nevertheless, he proclaims himself, the emperor proclaims himself bound by laws, but it's not true. That's what the gloss says here, but with all due respect, Cino says, it doesn't rightly understand. Therefore, Cino says that the emperor is necessarily unbound by laws. However, he wants to be bound by laws by reasons of honesty, for reasons of honesty, because honor is esteemed as a sacred bond of law. The emperor, the legislator, prince, cannot dishonor himself, in Cino's thought. Furthermore, against the argument that voluntary submission to the laws would be a diminution of that majestas that, on the contrary, the emperor is obliged to increase, Cino attaches the opposite argument of a superior dignity of power bound to honestas. He says, because so doing, the emperor doesn't diminish his own authority, but instead he increases it so that it's a honor to be bound. It's a honor to be bound. He again rejects the opinion of the gloss, saying, going on here, says the text of the law that it's a greater power, and so on. I ask, Cino says, why is it greater? Here the gloss says because empire derives from fortune, but it seems to me that the gloss is again in error, because empire derives from God. These are almost the same words used by his friend Dante when, in the Monarchia, in the monarchy, he condemns those presumptuous jurists who think that empire derives from fortune and not by God. Finally, Cino refers to the question already formed by other jurists, and especially by Guido da Suzzara at the end of the 13th century, whether the prince and his successors are obliged to conform to the contracts enforced by oaths sworn to his subjects, cum aliqua civitate. On this point, Cino offers a positive answer because of the necessary obligation arising from natural law. He says, grave est fidem fallere, et naturalia iura suadent pacta servari, quia honestas ligat etiam principem. It is grave, it is a grave fault not to keep the faith, and natural rights induce to observe the covenants, since the faith must also be maintained toward enemies, because honesty also obliges the prince, as is clear from the text of the law, and nothing is more due to a man than the observance of covenants. Then Cino concludes his commentary on the law, Digna Vox, with the proclamation of the right of the subjects to resist the prince. Justitia resistendo, si ex parte domini sit injusta et notoria violentia, resisting by justice, if by the prince is made an unjust and notorious violence. That is to say, if the prince violates the agreements, which are nothing but his own law, for prince's contract has the force of law. A generation later, his pupil Bartolus, the major representative of the entire trend in medieval legal thought, repeated this doctrine, extending the principle of submission to equity, to every form of power, and obliging the emperor to the principle of stare pactis, by conformity to the rule established in Justinian's institutes, Jura Naturalia sunt immutabilia, course. And Bartolus resumes the content of the law and says that the law says briefly here, it is just and worthy for the prince to live according to the laws as whoever exercises power. This is opposed by the fact that the prince is not really bound by the laws. In solution, I say, Bartolus says, that it is true that the prince is not bound by the laws, but it is fair and worthy that he live by the laws. Thus, says the text of the law, so that he voluntarily submits to the laws, not by necessity. And this is how this law must be understood. So I ask, what happens if the emperor makes a pact with the city? Is he obliged to observe the pact? It seems not, since he is not bound by the laws, but the opposite is true. In fact, pacts belong to the law of nations. The laws of nations are immutable, and this is the opinion of the jurists, to which Cino, his master, refers here. And finally, Baldus de Ubaldis also taught the same doctrine at the end of the 14th century, defiantly establishing with a theoretical scheme of limited sovereignty in the doctrine of jus commune. Baldus also talks about the bond of honestas and the principle of natural law that requires the observance of pacts, but he declares the twofold nature of sovereignty by reason of the distinction between the abstract dimension of power, that is to say, the potestas absoluta, the power devoid of constraints of a juridical nature, and the concrete dimension of its exercise, the potestas ordinaria or ordinata, subject to obedience to the laws. And he says that the prince must live according to laws, for his own authority depends on law. The meaning of this word, he says, must, debet, has to be understood as referring to the duty of honesty, which must be the highest in the prince. But it must not be understood in the very strict sense, because the supreme and absolute power of the prince is not subject to the law. Therefore, this law, he says, the law Digna Vox, concerns ordinary power, not absolute power. And Baldus also concludes by attaching Cino in favor of obedience to the pacts between sovereign and subjects. considering those pacts also mandatory for the prince's successors. Chino says that such a pact must be observed if the emperor makes peace or comes to terms with his own subjects in view of a general and public welfare, and that these pacts must not be violated by his successor unless the subjects are guilty of willful misconduct or fraud. The idea of sovereignty subject to lawful and valid negotiations, pacts and agreements, Herrschaftsverträge, to use a formulation of the ancient German tradition, expressed in this way by medieval commentators, had naturally found a very important foothold in the theological doctrine of the late 13th century. It will be sufficient to recall the famous place of the Summa Theologiae, in which Thomas Aquinas, posing the question of the independence of the princeps from positive legal constraints, argues that if, in proper terms, nullus cogitur a se ipso, that is, no one can legally oblige himself to himself, and therefore be a principle of limitation of his own power in legal terms, however, it must be affirmed that the princeps, even if he is free from the binding force of the laws, is morally bound to their obedience. In this contractualist doctrine, we can trace the not too distant roots of a constitutional tradition that is not only medieval, but I think belongs fully to the early modernity and remains as one of the fundamental features of the entire Western legal tradition, marked by the dialectic between the two distinct aspects of a, so to speak, Janus-hated sovereignty. Sovereignty implies the solutio a legibus, that is, independence from the coercive force of the law deriving from the princeps, who, however, is bound by a moral principle and by submission to the law of nations, natural law and divine law, which overwhelm positive law. But it is the Middle Ages that preserve and transmit to the modern world the most faithful mirror of sovereignty, with its twofold feature, in which the twofold feature of the normative phenomenon is reflected. For this reason, Barthelus, in his commentary on Justinian Code 1:22:6, tackles the problem of the validity of legal provisions contrary to divine law, following the solution of the gloss, and saying, if the prince's rescript is contrary to divine law, it has no value. However, human law can interpret the law of God. Furthermore, Barthelus recognizes that the legislator can derogate from the law of the nations, ius commune condendo and jurisdictionem exercendo, creating a common law, common laws, and exercising jurisdiction. But he denies that the prince can derogate from the law of the nations on the basis of a simple act of volition and sine aliqua causa, without a just cause. Therefore, Barthelus writes, expressing his faith in the moral substance of law, I do not think, he says, I do not think it is true that the princeps can do something against justice, because the prince cannot make a single law in which there is only one dishonest or unjust thing. In fact, this is contrary to the substance of the law, because the law is a holy sanction which orders what is honest and prohibits what is contrary to it. Finally, only the crisis of the end of the 16th century imposes the search for a new doctrinal foundation for the claims of the state. In 1583, responding to the author of the Vindice contra Tyrannos, in an addition to the latest French edition of the République, the jurist Jean Baudin wrote in his French, et par ainsi, quand j'ai par-ci devant écrit qu'il faut un État bien ordonné, que la puissance souveraine soit à un seul, sans que les États y aient part, ni puissance de lui donner loi, ce n'est pas pour le plaisir du prince qu'on tient cette opinion, mais pour la sûreté et vie heureuse des sujets. Et au contraire, quand on vient à limiter la puissance du monarque pour l'assujettir aux États du peuple ou du Sénat, la souveraineté n'a point de fondement assuré. Il se forme une confusion populaire ou anarchie misérable, peste des États et de républiques. Ce qu'il faut bien peser, et ne s'arrêtez pas aux beaux discours de ceux qui font croire au sujet qu'il est nécessaire d'assujettir le monarque au peuple et faire que les sujets donnent loi à leur prince, attendu que c'est la ruine non seulement de monarchie, mais aussi de sujets. Baudin affirms the individual nature of sovereignty, rejecting any contractual conception of power, because that conception implies the idea of a conventional nature of the law, and consequently, the subjection of the sovereign to the law. He therefore writes against the supporters of the mixed constitution, and particularly against those who have spoken of the best form of state as that which originates from the mixture of three different regimes, which would be, in his thought, which would be only the index of the inability of each organ of the state to exercise sovereignty. The République witnesses the difficult separation from the doctrinal tradition of the juridical Middle Ages, especially in those places where Baudin speaks not of sovereignty as an abstract principle, that is the potestas absoluta, but of the concrete exercise of power in his relations with subjects, and the judiciary, that is the potestas ordinaria et ordinata. Baudin defines sovereignty simply as la puissance absolue et perpétuelle d'une république, the absolute and perpetual power of a state between the two aspects of power. He prefers the potestas absoluta and only the potestas absoluta, thus forcing to radicalization those concepts that the legal and political Middle Age had experienced in friction, but not in total irreconcilability. On the contrary, the main concern of medieval thought was aimed at defining the content of the prince's power with a very strong impulse to reconcile the absolutist and legalitarian claims, both present in the paradigm of Roman law. Medieval jurists, as Ennio Cortese has put it, grasped this duplicity of aspects, which the Roman world had envisioned in a confused way between an abstract power, de jure, of exceptional use in the hands of a monarch, ideally freed from obedience, to the laws, and the potestas, usually called ordinary or ordinata, which was, on the contrary, a current, concrete, and daily exercise, had a legalitarian, so to speak, nature, and was evoked, above all, by the famous law, Digna vox. Two aspects of a double-faced, a genus-hated sovereignty that will constitute, up to modern times, the constant and fundamental plot of doctrinal elaboration. This will be so, beginning with Altosius, for example, and his radical criticism of Baudin's concepts of civil law, of civil laws devoid of any moral content, and will be further demonstrated by the whole season of modern contractualist theories. Thank you so much. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Quaglioni. It's sad that we cannot express our gratitude to hear your speech. Again, thank you very much. And for people who are still up here, as we know, this first this opening lecture will not be submitted as a sequence of debate, but it's also important to to remember the importance of this reflections as a framework for our next sessions and our discussions. I'm a huge fan of Professor Quaglione's work, and I still remember the first time I heard his speech in Madrid a couple of years ago in an event organized by Professor François Foronde, and it really changed a lot of perceptions that I was still building by my own. And it's always a pleasure when I read his texts and again, and these small perceptions of especially this continuity of the contractualism, you can say so, are still present in our way to understand it, our basic notions of social contract. And at the same time, this huge ambiguity of the power, and this is the thing, the power and its material, its magma of how it is changeable, how it is ambiguous in the way to understanding. And I hope we can amplify these discussions now then in the next sessions, talking about different approaches and different experiences, the way to understand resistance, where this very specific point can be used for more discussions. I hope we can come back to these topics in our further sessions, and despite the fact that we're not open for debate, it doesn't impede us to talk again in the next moments.